All right. I think we might go ahead, at least my part, we can get started. I'm going to introduce someone I've had the privilege of working with for a long time. I think now 12 or 13 years. And it's part of what makes my job fun and interesting and great is working with people like Lendol. So I'm happy to introduce Lendol Calder. He's a professor of American history at Augustana College in Illinois. That's in the Quad Cities. He's been inspiring students in introductory U.S. history courses since his graduate student days at the University of Chicago. I can't say that about myself. Honored as the 2010 Illinois Professor of the Year. The citation praised him for epitomizing advice given by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Do not go where the path may lead, go instead where there is no path and leave a trail. Calder's 1999 book, Financing the American Dream, A Cultural History of Consumer Credit, was described by the New York Times as immensely influential, sparking renewed interest among historians in the history of capitalism. But his research trajectory shifted when a chance remark from the late Roland Marchand, "Why are historians so uncurious about teaching?" encouraged Calder to join the newly formed Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, a study center dedicated to improving college teaching on the basis of evidence-based intellectual work. As one of its fellows, Calder delved into the Introductory History course, resulting in his groundbreaking 2006 article in the Journal of American History, Uncoverage Toward a Signature Pedagogy for the History Survey, which the president of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning has called the gateway drug for history total. A subsequent essay, The Stories We Tell, won the American Historical Association's Gilbert Prize in 2014. In his most recent publication, Must History Students Write History Essays?, Calder offers essential insights for teachers navigating the challenges posed by AI technology and teaching history to diverse students. So, I welcome Lendol Calder.
Thank you, Julia. Does my microphone level seem about right? It's on? It's a pleasure to be back at the Texas History Conference. I think I spoke at the first one in 2015.
We're just getting your mic level good. Sorry.
Okay. How's it now?
Someone give me a thumbs up back there.
How's the level now?
Yeah? Okay. All right, good.
I want to start, now I hear it. I'll start this talk with a line that I remember from a book called The History and Narrative Reader. If you ask a historian to explain something, chances are they will tell you a story. The question I want to think about with you today is the same true of history teachers? If you ask history teachers to explain something to you about world history or about the United States history, about Texas history, are they going to tell you some stories? Now, there's no survey data on this question, so I can't answer it with any kind of real knowledge, which means I have to be personal and just tell you my experience. And I will tell you that for most of my teaching career, stories didn't really enter into it. As a teacher, I was doing other things. Now, I cannot believe it, but this month marks 30 years since I first stepped to a podium to teach an introductory history course. 1993, I was at the University of Washington, Seattle for 1 year and taught the second half of what then I called the U.S. History Survey. And I taught it in the traditional way. I lectured every day for 50 minutes. Students read books. I secretly ordered a textbook for myself, which was the syllabus to the course. And I raced to cover all the information that was in that textbook. I recognized that coverage was a problem, but I had worked out a really good solution. I was just going to talk really, really fast. I taught that way for a couple of years until I began to realize that talking really fast was not a good solution to the problem of coverage. And so, in my 30-year career of teaching introductory courses, there have been 2 Copernican revolutions in what my course looks like. The first happened in the late 1990s, and later I wrote about that revolution, that turn away from coverage of information towards the uncovering of mental habits that we historians share as we make sense of the world. And I called that should be the signature pedagogy for history courses, rather than the generic pedagogy I used to practice, where my lecture looked basically the same as a biology professor lecturing or a sociology professor in the next lecture hall lecturing. History needs a signature pedagogy, I argued, and I gave it my best shot for creating what that would look like. I'd still be teaching that course today, except for a couple of things. One was the growing social and political crisis of our times, culminating in January 6th. I'd still be teaching that old historical thinking-centered course, except for another crisis that I was watching closely in the 2010s, the history enrollment crisis. And I'd still be teaching that course, I think, except for some data that I was beginning to wrestle with. And I'm going to share this data with you today as a way of explaining why I altered my course a second fundamental time just 5 years ago. This time to put storytelling at the center of the course as one example of historical thinking. This data is interesting. It challenges common conceptions people have about how young people make sense of the past. This data is troubling to me, and I'll share with you why I'm troubled by it. But it's also generative data, because it suggested to me a moment of opportunity where I could act on this data to change my course and make an introductory history class better for student learning. And it also suggested to me a role that I could play in the ongoing drama that is the story of civil democracy in our country. And if I could convince any of you today to join me in this role, I'd be glad, more than glad, to have some fellow peacemakers. So, the data. Well, this was working earlier, but it's not working now.
There we go. Ta-da.
Yeah, but do you think we can make this work? So I
Let's find
don't
out.
have to come over here?
That would be a good thing, wouldn't it? Let's try it. That should be good to go. Yeah, there we go. We're back.
Great. Well, my introductory U.S. history course has changed substantially over 30 years. There's one assignment that I give on the first or second day of class that has remained the same since 1994. I call it the Story of America assignment, and it came to be like this. In 1994, I went to a tiny Colby Sawyer College in rural New Hampshire for my first tenure-track job. And looking at the students, I could tell right away I did not know what was inside their heads. These were not like University of Chicago students or University of Washington students, and they weren't like me. I could tell that right away. Not an Astros fan in the group there in New Hampshire. They just were not like me. how to find out what was in their heads. I could have given a multiple choice test to find out what they knew about American history, but that would have told me what they didn't know. I wanted to know what they did know. And so I developed an assignment called The Story of America, where I asked students to imagine they were traveling in a foreign country. They go in a coffee shop, and they start talking in English with the national from this other country. And they talk about music, and they talk about movies. And maybe this person just saw the movie Lincoln, or maybe they just saw today Oppenheimer. And now we're talking about history in the United States and its development over time. And our foreign friend at some point says, "I'd like to know more about American history. Can you tell me the story of your country?" And to the students, I said, "What would you tell them?" And this assignment has two conditions. First, it has to be in 1 page or less, 600 words. I guess that's 2 pages. It's got to be 600 words or less. And 2, you can't look anything up. You got to write it out of your head. Now, the students assume that I'm testing for how much they remember from high school history. That's not really what I was looking for. I was wanting to know what template they had in their head for making sense of American history at a meta level. The students in 1994 wrote up 30 histories. We passed them around in class that first week, and we had a look at what they had produced. And this is what we found. In 1994, my memory is that about 90% of the stories were stories of American exceptionalism. 9 out of 10 students in that class of 30 told a story about why and how the United States became number one. Exceptional in so many ways. Exceptional in its commitment to liberty. Exceptional in the pursuit of scientific progress. Exceptional in the degree it has made strides towards equality for all citizens. Exceptional for its ability to project military might around the world for good. That's the kind of story most of the students told in 1994. Now, here in 2023, we don't hear that story very often, and very few people in this room, I'm going to guess, actually use that story to make sense of American history. So I want to play you a movie clip of this story just to remind you of the power that this story can have, used to have, might someday again have, I suppose. This is a clip that in 1994 I happened to be showing anyway in my class, and the students, when they saw this clip, immediately made the connection to our Story of America assignment and said, "Hey, I recognize that story. That's what we wrote about in our papers last week on the Story of America." Let's see if I can dial this up. The story is told by Frank Capra. It's in film 7 of his Why We Fight film series.
Only a dream.
Capra worked on this film series from 1940 to 1945. This film that we're watching a clip from actually came out in the spring of 1945 as the European War was winding down. Why is Capra one of the greatest directors in Hollywood history making movies for the U.S. Army and for the American public? I love talking to students about that question. What does it mean that the Army had to draft Frank Capra to make movies about why we should be fighting? Students originally want to say, it just shows how unified the country was and how patriotic everybody was. And I wait for, one of the students to say, well, wait a minute. If they were so unified and patriotic, why did you need to make a movie about it? And that is real historical thinking there. We call that contextualization. The movie itself suggests that maybe by 1945, Americans were tired of fighting. Maybe the shift to a Pacific focus in the war was not something anybody really relished. So you needed to have this film to rally the troops. And how does Capra start the movie? He starts with a story about America.
Over this ocean, 1607, Jamestown. 1620, Plymouth Rock. Here was America, the sea, the sky, the virgin continent. We came in search of freedom, facing unknown dangers rather than bend the knee or bow to tyranny. Out of the native oak and pine, we built a house, a church, a watchtower. We cleared a field, and there grew up a colony of free citizens. We carved new states out of the green wilderness: Virginia, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Carolina. Then came the first test in the defense of that liberty. 1775, Lexington. Our leaders spoke our deepest needs. Colonists are by the law of nature free-born, as indeed all men are. It is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. These are the times that try men's souls. But as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. In the midst of battle, it happened. The idea grew. The idea took form. Something new was expressed by men, a new and revolutionary doctrine, the greatest creative force in human relations. All men are created equal. All men are entitled to the blessings of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the goal we set for ourselves. Defeat meant hanging. Victory meant a world in which Americans rule themselves. 1777, Valley Forge. We fought and froze, suffered and died. For what? For the future freedom of all Americans. A few of us doubted and despaired. Most of us prayed and endured all. 1781, Yorktown. Now we were a free, independent nation. The new idea had won its first test. Now to pass it on to future Americans. The Constitution, the sacred charter of we the people. The blood and sweat of we the people. The life, liberty, and happiness of we the people. The people were to rule, not some of the people, not the best people or the worst, not the rich people or the poor, but we, the people, all the people. In this brotherhood, America was born. One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We began as 13 states along the Atlantic seaboard. We pushed across the Alleghenies, the Ohio River, the Mississippi, the last far range of the distant Rockies. We carried freedom with us. No aristocratic classes here, no kings, no nobles or princes, no state church, no courts, no parasites, no divine right of man to rule man. Here, humanity was making a clean, fresh start from scratch. Behind us, we left new states, chips off the old blocks welded together by freedom.
This cartoon that we're watching here was drawn by Walt Disney.
Until finally we were one nation, a land of hope and opportunity that had arisen out of a skeptical world. A light was shining, freedom's light. From every country and every clime, men saw that light and turned their faces toward it. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. As strangers to one another we came and built a country, and the country built us into Americans. The sweat of the men of old nations was poured out to build anew. The sweat of our first settlers, the English, the Scotch, the Dutch, building the workshop of New England, of the Italian in the sulfur mines of Louisiana, of the Frenchman and the Swiss in the vineyards of California and New York State, of the Dane, the Norwegian, the Swede, seeding the good earth to make the Midwest bloom with grain, of the Pole and the Welshman, of the Negro harvesting cotton in the hot southern sun, of the Spaniard, the first to roam the great Southwest, of the Mexican in the oil fields of Texas and on the ranches of New Mexico, of the Greek and the Portuguese harvesting the crop the ocean yields, of the German with his technical skill, of the Hungarian and the Russian, of the Irishman, the Slav, and the Chinese working side by side. The sweat of Americans, and a great nation was built. Americans has been freely shed. 5 times in our history have we withstood the challenge to the idea that made our nation, the idea of equality for all men, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the idea that made us the people we are.
Frank Capra's propaganda film here is one of the most powerful stories about the United States that has ever been told. In 1994,
let's take a look at ourselves before we went into this.
I don't see a way to exit out of, oh, there it is. There we go. And in 1994, most of my students, all except 2, told a Bowdlerized version of that story. And as they came to an awareness of that in our class, I asked them, what are we going to call this story? We need a name for it. And one student who had read ahead in next week's reading in Howard Zinn said, Well, Howard Zinn calls this the glory story. It's a story that goes by many names. American exceptionalism. Bruce Van Sudwright calls it the Freedom Quest narrative. But we went with the glory story following Professor Zinn. There was one student in the class who didn't see it that way. The problem with the glory story, and the reason why I guess it's easy to laugh at now, is it leaves out so much. And therefore it becomes fairly easy to ridicule. As this one student pointed out, once we saw the Frank Capra story, where are the Native Americans when all those pioneers are going across the uninhabited American desert? There's nothing in here about slavery at all. There's a lot left out of this story, she pointed out. In her own history of the United States, she had described American history as a story that was born in a crime, the stealing of land from its indigenous peoples, and continued with an atrocity. And she described how slavery came to the United States and what its effect was. And now, I'm not saying she told these stories well. None of these students are telling great stories, but she had the elements of a very different understanding of American history in her story there in 1994. I said, what do we want to call this? And the poor student, because she was all by herself, was kind of squinching down in her seat, well aware that she was a minority of one and viewing American history this way. So I pointed out to her that this actually was the oldest story anybody had written down about colonization in the New World. Bartolomeo de las Casas, who wrote the first European history of colonization in the New World, told basically this story in his description of the various crimes of the conquistadors. His story was so powerful that he was convinced the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, that the conquest was unjust and should be stopped. So I said, don't, you're not a minority here. This is an old story that goes way, way back. What are we going to call it? I thought we might call it a grave mistake. But another student said, let's call it the gory story. I thought, glory story, gory story. I like that pairing. And so that's what we've been calling it, the gory story. Gory stories are quite common today. At my college, for 2 years now, we've had all the freshmen read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, which is a letter to his son about American history, Between the World and Me. This is what Coates says in that book. Oops. From 1619 until the late 1960s, American institutions, businesses, associations, and governments repeatedly plundered black communities. Their methods included everything from land theft to redlining to disenfranchisement to convict lease labor to lynching to enslavement to the vending of children. So large was this plunder that America, as we know it today, is simply unimaginable without it. That's a contemporary example of a gory story about the United States. Now, those of you who were here last year heard Johann Neem give a name to this story. He calls it the post-American history. And in Neem's account of stories about America, there are two basic stories. Stories that take their inspiration from the glory story, imagining a hopeful future for the United States, and then what he calls post-American histories, like Ta-Nehisi Coates', that have no hope for future redemption under our current system of government. And these newer gory stories The idea seems to be that we need an entirely new accounting of the American past, not because the stories we're currently teaching are incomplete, but because they're a lie. Post-American historians believe that the country was founded on racism and is defined by white supremacy up to our present moment. So it's not just that America has a history of racism, it's that America exists for and because of racism. It's a country for white people, with white supremacy its defining feature. The story of America was stamped from the beginning, to use Ibram Kendi's words, and therefore is irredeemable. So in 1994, I had mostly glory stories. One student told a gory story, and then there was this oddity. And I still have the paper, and I can almost quote it from memory. In the beginning, there were cavemen and dinosaurs. And then the Indians killed all the dinosaurs. And then white people came to America, and at first they were cool with the Indians. But then they killed all the Indians. And then something else happened, and then another thing happened. And then out of nowhere, Vietnam happened. I remember that phrase. And then Woodstock happened, and musicians were dropping like flies. Kurt Cobain blew his head off, and Jimi Hendrix overdosed. And then the student skipped 2 lines and just wrote, "Cars!" exclamation point. Well, looking at that history with my students, I said, "What do you make of this?" And one student said, "You know what that reminds me of? It reminds me of that Billy Joel song, 'We Didn't Start the Fire.'" If you know this song, it too just presents a rat-a-tat-a-tat of unrelated random type events arranged in chronological order. What do we call this story? Privately, I was thinking, well, this student just misunderstood the assignment. But my students in the class said, let's call this the chaos story, because it doesn't make any sense. It's just random stuff. So we went with that. Now, I'll pause here to ask you, are you telling any of these stories, those of you who teach U.S. history? Or if you're teaching world history, do you tell any big meta-narrative stories that make sense of world history? If you're teaching Texas history, are you telling stories about competing stories anyway, about Texas history that attempt to make sense of the subject as a whole? That's a real question. If with somebody right next to you, what are you telling stories of this type in your introductory history courses? And so, what story are you telling? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to actually talk about that with a partner. All right. I have to draw on my experience as a Cub Scout packmaster. When the hand goes up, the mouth goes shut. I continued to give this assignment through the rest of the 90s, and I started seeing other stories. A student might tell a story about how out of many came one people. I got stories about cycles in American history, usually cycles of war after war after war after war, and then some kind of claim about how that made America what it is today. You know, you're probably familiar with Arthur Schlesinger's cyclical story of American history, where American history alternates back and forth between 20 years of selfishness and 20 years of public spiritedness, back and forth, back and forth. I got solipsistic stories that began, American history began when I was born in 1983, or stuff like that. All kinds of one-off stories. But I began to notice a few other patterns beyond the glory story and the gory story. One was a biblical story that I'm now called the covenant story. This is a story heavily indebted to the book of Exodus. The Exodus story is a story in 6 acts. First, there's a life of slavery and oppression. Then comes a revolt against that tyranny, and then a difficult flight through a howling wilderness of desert. Then there's infighting and misbehavior among the people and the stresses that come from that ordeal. Then there's the handing down of a new covenant, a new law. And finally, the arrival into a promised land of opportunity and the beginning of a project to build a new Jerusalem. That story has had a great influence on many Americans in the way that they understand the story of their country. The Puritans were the first to tell an Exodus-type story about the United States, about the colonies then. They came to the New World believing that they were escaping the bondage of Egypt themselves, and they wanted to build a new Jerusalem. The interesting thing about the covenant story is that it's always been self-critical. We remember the phrase "city upon a hill" from John Winthrop, but he didn't mean by that what politicians today mean by it. Today, that's used as a kind of summation of the exceptional glory story version of American history to say that we're a city on a hill. But Winthrop didn't mean that at all. He meant the whole world was looking at us, and we better not screw this up, but I fear we're going to. That's what he originally meant. And that self-critical side of the covenant story has continued in modern iterations. We find this story in the teachings of Frederick Douglass, for example. We find this story in the 20th century in the speeches and sermons of Martin Luther King Jr. and others civil rights leaders in the southern phase of the black freedom struggle. 20th century presidents, especially those who are center-left, often tell a version of the covenant story. Most recently, I saw Michelle Obama telling this story at the 2016 Democratic National Convention. That's the story of this country, she told her audience, the story that's brought me to this stage tonight. The story of generations of people who felt the lash of bondage, the shame of servitude, the sting of segregation, but who kept on striving. And she credits Hillary Clinton because thanks to her, my daughters and all our sons and daughters now take it for granted a woman can be president of the United States. So look, she told conventioneers, don't let anybody ever tell you this country isn't great. But somehow we need to make it great again. Because this right now is the greatest country on earth. Now, in her context where she is responding to Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again story of American history, she nudges into the glory story territory here, calling the United States an exceptional country, the greatest on earth. But in the context of her speech and of her other writings and sayings, she definitely is telling an Exodus-inflected covenant story. Others who tell covenant stories would be Jill Lepore, Ronald Takaki, or even Eric Foner in his often assigned textbook, The Story of American Freedom. Another story that we have to face up to in any course on U.S. history is a story that is a nostalgic, it's a white nostalgia story, and maybe we should just call it for what it is. It's the white supremacy story of American history. Ours is the government of the white man, said John Calhoun in 1848, arguing against admitting Mexicans as citizens to the United States. This government was made by our fathers on the white basis, said Stephen Douglas 10 years later. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. Douglas went on to debate Abraham Lincoln over the value of this story of American history, with Lincoln building on arguments made by Frederick Douglass, exposing Douglass's story as a fiction. Anyway, the founders of the Confederacy answered, basically agreeing with Lincoln, and created a new government, a new constitution, founded upon exactly the opposite ideas of the founders of 1776. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery is his natural and moral condition. That's straight out of the Constitution for the Confederate States of America. The North won the war, but as Heather Cox Richardson has recently argued, they lost the history struggle for understanding America's past. And a white supremacist, nostalgic story, sometimes we call it the lost cause story, swept the nation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now that's the strong form of the white supremacy story. In its weak form, I suppose, it shows itself as Donald Trump's narrative of American history, where he wants to make America great again. I don't know that he's ever come out and just specifically said white again, but certainly one can see that subtext in his speeches about American history. Glory story, a gory story, a chaos story, the covenant story, the white supremacy story. One final story that I think is important to teach students is one that I almost never see in their own histories of America, but which has been an influential story among American elites. And that's a story told by Howard Zinn in his best-selling textbook, A People's History of the United States. We call this story The People versus the Elites. The United States is run by a cabal called the 1% in Zinn's book, who oppress the remaining 99%, which he thinks includes most of us. And this is irredeemable. This would fit right there in Johann Niem's post-American stories, because the only way to change this would be to tear up the existing constitutional arrangement and start over with some other kind of system of government. Zinn's story, for 50 years, was the only attempt by an academic historian to tell a big story about the United States. That's one reason for its popularity. It was the only game in town. Most historians, academic historians, turned away from big narratives after the Vietnam War. They went to either smaller topics or bigger topics. Smaller topics investigating local communities, believing that it was impossible to say anything fundamentally true about a big subject like the United States. So historians dived into community studies, into histories of smaller subsets of social groups, And out of that came a flowering of scholarship that we're all very grateful for. Our other historians went the other way and began arguing world history and global histories were what students needed to know. And the United States, as a national history, should be de-emphasized in order to stress world citizenship. What happens when academic historians no longer try to narrate the history of the nation? It's not that nationalism dies and goes away. That's not what happens. What happens is charlatans, stooges, outright crooks come in and start narrating the national history for people. And that's what has happened in the last 50 years. Make America Great Again is simply one example of many just terrible stories, terribly untrue stories, that have come in and swept the field because academic historians ceded it to popular historians. 30 years of giving my Story of America assignment has enabled me to accumulate a lot of data. I've read 1,500 stories in 30 years. And starting in 2000, I began categorizing the stories and keeping records of what stories students were telling. Here are the results from this data collection. In 2000, it wasn't true anymore that most of my students were telling a glory story. The red portion of the bar shows that in 2000, about half of my students were telling a glory story. The green bar is a gory story. Looks like one student or two students in 2000 had that to tell. The covenant story, a few students told that. Then there were just a lot of one-off type stories. But looky here. The gray part of the chart is that no story, that chaos story, that history is just one damn thing after another story. Only one student had done that in 1994, but by 2000, almost 1 out of 3 students didn't have a story to tell. And now look what happens since 2000. Look at the gray part of the chart. We get to fall of 2018, and for the first time ever, not a single student told a glory story. Not a single one. And meanwhile, look at how many don't have a story to tell anymore. History is just a chronology of random facts in a kind of Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire fashion. Nothing makes sense. There are no patterns. It's just all random and unpredictable. What does that mean? Well, the good news here is students know a lot of history. They struggled to pack in all the things they know about the American past in 2 pages. So they know a lot of stuff. The bad news is none of it makes sense. In fact, it's nonsense. I don't think that's a good thing. Now, why has this development happened among at least my students? I've heard lots of explanations. When I talk to high school teachers, they blame this on high-stakes testing and the influence of the advanced placement program, which causes them to have to attend to a minutia of facts, basically, and then that's what students kind of remember when they come to my class in college. That may be part of it, but I suspect the bigger explanation is that the old glory story meta-narrative has lost salience just in our culture in general, and so it's that big story is no longer supported. My students come to college, they already know that Christopher Columbus was an asshole. They know that slavery existed, even if they don't know much about it. And they know that the United States has been an irresponsible actor sometimes on the world. That's what's in their heads just from American popular culture. And I don't think that this is a good thing. Because if history doesn't make sense to you, why would you want to study it? Why would you ever want to think about it? And there's got to be a connection between this loss of metanarrative at the national history level and declining interest among students in taking a history class. Because it just doesn't make sense to them. So I want to make an argument, and I'm out of time already, so I'll make this very quick, that we should return metanarrative to our classes. Big stories about world history, about U.S. national history, about Texas history. And the reason we should do this is because this is what historians do. We make accounts of the past, usually by telling a story about it. We don't make sense of the past through mathematical equations. We don't run experiments in a laboratory to make sense of the world. That's what scientists do. For historians, our sense-making apparatus is narrative. How come we're not teaching students to recognize a story when they see one and to tell a good story from a bad one? Seems to me like that should be at the forefront of a good introductory course. And it's not just historians who do this. This turns out to be human. Muriel Rukeyser, 20th century feminist poet, says the universe is made of stories, not of atoms. Stories tell us who we are and what we're supposed to do next. That's why Frank Capra started his film with the story about American history. The story told people who they were as Americans, and it told them what they should do next. Go and fight for democracy and liberty and freedom. Cognitive psychologists, and I'm thinking here of Daniel Willingham, who's written about this in several books, tell us now that it's not just poets who think the world is made of stories. Scientists believe this about the human brain, too. We make sense of the world primarily through stories. So when students don't have stories to tell about historical subjects, not really teaching a humanities class there, it's an anti-humanities class, because stories are how human beings navigate their way through the world. We remember what we think about, and what we like to think about as humans are stories. That's why your typical student can quote to you dialogue verbatim from a movie they saw 5 years ago, but they can't score well on a multiple choice history test. The movie had a story to tell, so it made it memorable. And Daniel Willingham's advice to professors and teachers is, make every class a story. This seems critical for our current moment because it's not a coincidence that when academic historians stopped telling big stories, that American politics went off the rails into a culture war between popular historians who have their own terrible stories to tell. Our time is also marked by high levels of so-called deaths of despair, suicide, and depression. There are many reasons for that, and it's a complicated subject, but part of the reason, surely, is the loss of stories that people can live in, find themselves in, and know who they are and what they should do next. So, 5 years ago, in a second Copernican revolution in my introductory course, I made the central project of the course a search for a new story to tell about the American past. On the front cover of my syllabus, you see a picture of the January 6th rebellion paired with the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina coup where white supremacist Democrats threw out mixed-race Republican government in the city of Wilmington and killed about 45 people. The idea here being that January 6th didn't come out of nowhere. There's a history behind this kind of activity that we need to know. What's the story that best makes sense of the American past? On the second page of my syllabus, that's the first of the 3 big questions for the course. Most important teaching advice I think I've ever heard was that courses need to address big questions, and these are the ones my introductory course now addresses. What are the stories that people have told to make sense of the American past? And my students will become acquainted with those 6 stories that I outlined earlier. I will train them to spot those stories when they see them out of class, on TV, on the internet, in speeches. The second question is, how do historians distinguish between good stories and bad stories? Plausible ones and implausible ones? And to answer that question, I share with students the elements of historical thinking that I've always emphasized in this course, at least since the late 1990s. Only now, in addition to the familiar historical heuristics, I've added storytelling and made it central to the course. These heuristics can help us find patterns in the noise, I tell students. On the first day of class, I give a little speech to sort of orient people to where we're going to go in the course. The speech rehearses some of the themes from my lecture today with you. We live in stories, I tell the students. What we are is stories. We do things because of what is called character, and our character is formed by the stories that we learn to live in. Late in the night, we lie in bed, breathing in the dark. We rework our stories. And we do it again the next morning and all day long before the looking glass of ourselves, reinventing our purposes. Without storytelling, it's hard to recognize ultimate reasons why any one action is more essential than another. Now, historians turned away from metanarratives in the 70s for some good reasons. Big metanarratives can be weaponized. They can justify totalitarian ideologies and mindsets, imperialist ambitions. They can justify the chauvinism of nation states. Ultimately, big stories can lead to genocides. But notice what I just did. In making a case against metanarrative, I just made a metanarrative about the world. It's inescapable. This is how we make sense of the past, is through these big stories. And do big stories only serve the interest of oppressors? What resistance movement can you think of didn't have a big story behind it, giving people the courage to keep on keeping on? Abolitionism? Feminism? The African American freedom struggle? They all went forward because the people in those movements were living in a big story that they deeply believed in, and it told them what they should do next. Right now, the 2 textbooks that we're reading in this course tell very different stories. And if I had to die for a principle that comes out of what I'm saying today, it's this. Every history course has to have some competing big narratives at the center of the course, not just one book with one narrative. Right now, and I've taught lots of different big story American history books over the years. Right now, I'm using Jill Lepore's These Truths paired with Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. I've used other more conservative inflected books in the past. This one right now is a pairing, though, I'm really excited about because I think Jill Lepore's book is really good. And it feels great to be teaching a book that I can kind of believe in as opposed to 2 bad history books And I don't mind calling Zen's book a bad history book. It's full of negative examples for how to think historically, which makes it a great teaching book in that way. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book, Myth, History, and Other Essays. It came out when I was in graduate school. It's by a former president of the American Historical Association, William McNeill. Those of you who teach world history are familiar with him. He's one of the sort of patriarchs of modern world history. I didn't remember this, but there's a chapter in this book that was a speech he gave at the American Historical Association to a panel on the introductory course, 1976, the year I graduated from high school. And in this talk, to what I'm going to guess was a poorly attended session, McNeill talks about what he calls the central failure of our profession in the last 20 years. And what was the central failure of the historical profession? The central failure, according to McNeill, was historians' unwillingness to rethink the basic introductory history course. They were stepping away from Western Civ as an idea. They were stepping away from U.S. history as an idea because historians felt like that was too supportive of nationalism. And he said, this is going to kill us. And he predicts in the speech that in another 20 years, history would go the way of classics. It'd be a major that just a couple of sharp students would be interested in, and then everybody else would avoid like the plague. Well, his prophecies come true, pretty much. And on the last page of the speech, he says, my Jeremiah has come to an end. Without a new basic course to teach to students of any and every specialization, the place of history in our colleges and universities is going to continue to shrink. What have you done, he asked his audience, what have you done to make that dismal future less likely? Well, this is what I have done and am doing. It's a small thing. I have no grandiose expectations here that my course makes that much of a difference to our social and political crises or even to the problem of history enrollments. If all of us were to take McNeill and my talk today seriously and begin telling these big stories, I don't know if that would make a difference either. But it seems like the right thing to do. Elmer Bendiner was a pilot flying missions over Germany in World War II. In his memoir, Benny, his crewmates called him Benny. Benny recounts how on one run over Dresden, he felt his liberator taking some heavy flak. He made it back to his airport in England and was astonished when he got out of the plane to see that his plane had taken 8 direct hits to the fuel tank and nothing had happened. Technicians opened up one of these shells and inside was a note that nobody could read. It was in Czech. They found somebody who spoke Czech, and this is what the note said. This is all we can do for you now. Bendiner owed his life to an enslaved laborer, Czech, probably Jewish, working away in a munitions factory, who was purposefully not doing proper wiring on the shells. This is all we can do for you now. That's my attitude about teaching the introductory history course. This is all I know to do right now, for the problems that he set us. We'll see if it's enough to make a difference. Thank you.